Cool. So I'm just going to start off. I'm Sam. I'm a lead engineer here on the front end team. So I work mostly in our app, which is here and here. It's a Backbone.JS, Marionette.JS single page application. It's connected to a couple different APIs that we put together. Half of them are in Java and half of them are in Ruby. And I'm going to walk you through it a little bit. And then we'll jump into a little bit of a presentation, just talking about, what we built. One of the interesting things that we built. So just a really high level, we have a couple different concepts of pages. So it's a single page app, but it sort of has a lot of different little things going on. There's a couple different indicators that you may pick up on that, like, clearly we're loading some data in the background. We have a lot of different representations of the same data. And we hit different API endpoints to fetch that data when we actually need it, rather than doing it all up front and making the user's experience like really slow when they first get to the app. So that was a page right there where we've gone and we've like refetched some different data from a different API endpoint, and we've got some fun animations. Joanne was saying that I should show you those, but we're not really going to talk about them. So. Quick demo, a lot of different little pages in there, a lot of different APIs that we're hitting. So give me a second here. This presentation could be a little bit easier if I could mirror and do show notes at the same time. Bear with me. Cool. Awesome. Okay, so now hopefully the start will be a little bit less rough. So yeah, routing made better. It's a little bit of a learning experience that we had from building and sort of growing the application that we built. So the first thing we want to talk about is what happens when you create a new Backbone.js, Marionette.js application. I'm sure you're all super familiar with this, right? But you end up basically spinning up a simple app with an app.js file or whatever, and a router.js file, and sort of like working through the ordinary steps, right? You sort of set up your router and you build out some basic views and your basic models and connect it to the back end. And then as things grow, you end up with this router that sort of, or at least we ended up with this router that sort of had a lot of routes that really just did the same thing, right? They end up calling like one method in your router, and that method is really just responsible for taking a view, newing it up, assigning maybe like a model property to it, and showing it in a region. So we were all psyched. We were like, okay, cool, refactor. So we went and we refactored it, and we ended up with a sort of simplified version here, but more or less almost all of our pages just sort of map to one sort of splat page, which we'd capture the name of. We'd look it up in some sort of map that had a bunch of views. We'd construct a new view, and we'd call another method to just stuff it in a region. I don't know if you've seen that sort of pattern before, but it worked out really well for us when our app started off, and basically the only data we needed to load was from one endpoint. And then we'd load the data, and then we'd call Marionette app.start, and we'd go about our merry way, and it was really easy. But what happened was our app got a lot more complicated. So we started having to account for a lot of different user states, as well as, so I should probably dig into that a little bit. So user states for us, our sign-up application is sort of embedded in our like logged in experience. So that meant that we had to build an app that could bootstrap itself and also understand that like half the time you're dealing with like somebody that's just signing up and they don't have a user in the scope of the application. And the other half of the time, you're actually dealing with like a real customer, and you're going to be able to make more API requests. Another one of those was just dealing with a RESTful API. So like an API that's RESTful, as you know, has a lot of resources. So there's a lot of different things, and things tend to be a little bit more granular that you're going to fetch. So that just sort of propagates models in your system and requires you to sort of want to load data only when you need it, rather than having to make like 100 XHTTP requests up front. 100 being a bit of an exaggeration. But, so in addition to that, we were trying to sort of figure out, now that we have all these other requirements, how can we improve that? Like, where do we go from where we are? How do we scale out our app without like our views getting really fat and just sort of doing like model.fetch and then on sync like re-render yourself, because that gets really gross. So we looked at Backbone, and Backbone didn't really have a strong opinion on it. And we looked at Marionette, and Marionette sort of doesn't really have a strong opinion on it either. So our approach was to go with sort of like a nested view approach. So for instance, we looked at one of those pages before that had a little like donut on it and like a list of items that were sort of the positions that we have. So maybe you're holding like 100 shares of Apple or something. And in that case, we would, before we loaded that view, we would load up an outer view, which would sort of just be a layout view in Marionette speak. It would like fetch a model from our endpoint, fetch a model from our API, which might be some data like your positions. That's going to have Apple and 100 shares or whatever. And then that would, when it was done, it would render an actual view or a collection of views in some sub-regions with that model attached to them. And that worked out pretty well. It sort of like had a view proliferation problem. So you end up saying like every time you need to load some data asynchronously, you need like at least 2 views involved, and that is unpleasant. So we sort of looked around, and this was like 3 years ago now, and we found Marinette Async. And we were like, oh, this is going to be great. It's going to solve all our problems because it just sort of makes view rendering and all the things around it asynchronous. So I don't know how many of you know, maybe raise your hands if you know what Marinette Async is. Anybody? Okay, so not a lot of people. I saw some people from our team raising their hands and shaking their heads. So Marinette Async is it's an extension of Marionette that basically makes everything that's in the view rendering pipeline asynchronous. So they have an implementation of region that is async, it uses promises. They have an implementation of item view, collection view, and the template cache. So it even fetches templates from your server asynchronously if you want. And so even though we didn't really want 90% of those things, it was super easy to basically just shim it in. And it gave us one thing that we really did want, which was this before render method. So if you look at, this is just like an extracted piece of junk from a view, but basically before render will be executed in the Marionette pipeline as the thing that happens before it even calls any of the rendering steps on a view, right? So you put a view in a region, it will call before render. If it's an async region, it will then like understand that that's going to return a promise, and it will wait for the promise to resolve. And then when it resolves, it will call the rest of the render pipeline. And so that was kind of neat. It made it really easy. So we could get rid of our like double view requirement, and we could just do that with one view. But it still kind of stunk because we had basically really fat views. Like we still really don't want that in our view, right? Like we want that to go somewhere else. But it doesn't really do that much. It's really just fetching a model. So that wasn't great. And then we just kind of went with that for a while. It worked. We didn't really hate it, but we wanted to go and upgrade Marionette to like the newest 2 point whatever, and that wasn't possible because Marinette Async was deprecated, and we had sort of relied upon a lot of the features. They didn't update it, so we realized, crap, now all these things, if we upgrade Marionette, half of our app will just stop working, right? A bunch of JavaScript errors and a wonderful time. So we decided to step back for a bit and think, like, look out at other frameworks out there and be like, oh, let's rewrite our app in something else, because like that's what every fun JavaScript engineer wants to do, is like throw out everything they've done and rewrite it because they're so smart now. But so we looked around. We looked at Marionette and we were like, okay, Marionette, what are we supposed to do to solve this problem? And so Marionette, maybe I'm wrong, but a couple of us, I think we're pretty intelligent. We went through and combed the docs and sort of tried to find examples. And the best thing that they came up with was basically load the data that you need and then like launch your application. And that wasn't going to work for us. The next best thing that they have suggestion is sort of like using a lot of events and sort of like sub-modules. But then they sort of moved away from the module idea. So Marionette didn't really have our answer, or at least we couldn't find it. So then we looked at Angular and we're like, okay, is Angular doing something really smart? Like, how do they solve this problem? So Angular just waits. So they're just like, fine, like make a promise, and whenever you resolve it, like if you do, it's cool. If you don't, like we'll just wait, not a big deal. So really that's like implemented through some crazy stuff and a little bit of set interval. So there was nothing great to learn from there. Next one we looked at was Ember. So Ember's kind of like Backbone. It's sort of like, it's a little bit more opinionated Backbone. And so their sort of strategy was like, just do it wherever you need to do it. So load the data wherever you need to load the data. Use a route, like there's an async pipeline in routes. There's an async pipeline in our controllers. There's an async pipeline in our views. You're an idiot, just use Ember. And so, you know, as much as we didn't appreciate being made to feel like a bunch of idiots, we did get something out of that, which was maybe we can just build that async pipeline where we actually need it for ourselves. So we went back and thought about like what is Marinette Async buying us, which is really a bunch of stuff that we didn't need other than the one thing. So in the short term, we were like, okay, well let's just make this work. Let's upgrade all the things, and we'll hack in what we need, and then we'll think about building like something in the router layer to solve our problem. So you know, obvious. We just took the before render thing. We made our own like load this stuff before you call render. We had the onRender method in Marionette, just start a promise chain and then show a loading thing. We extracted the loading stuff eventually into like a base view or a mix-in, and we were pretty happy. You know, obviously less framework code means that we need to write more code and we need to maintain more code, which was not what we were looking for, so that was a bit of a sad face, but this worked in the short term. So from there, you know, the short term obviously becomes the long term, and we started, this is just a snap from our GitHub when I searched for like this code that I just showed you, and there were like 7 instances, and it was only, you know, a couple months later, and I was like, you know, that's more places where we have the same code just sort of like sprawling out, and it's going to have to be maintained, and it's going to be a pain in the butt. So let's get back to that router. Let's like actually do it. So, you know, forever sad. So we started making a case to ourselves that we should make this router. So I sort of jumped the gun on saying why we chose the router. So we could totally maintain what we were doing before, right? You just need some like interstitial step that basically will be responsible for waiting until you've done the thing that you need to do before it tries to render a view, right? Until it has all the data it needs. But we decided that that thing really made sense for us at the router level because most of the slices that were logical for where we needed to load new data was on this idea of a page in a single page app. So, you know, we could either throw out the single page app and re-implement everything in HTML and whatever cool framework is out there, probably Go, or we could solve our problem at the router level. So the obvious annoyances that I went through already, we ended up, you know, we have these fat, noisy views and some duplicated code, and this is just like an obvious pattern that should be extracted, and we're engineers, so let's do it. So the perks are obviously the opposites of that, right? Centralizing common behavior, reducing duplication of code, and separating out the concerns of views from routers, from layouts, and etc. So we drew, just to give you an idea of like, maybe this isn't like a super conventional problem to run into, but this is what our application sort of looked like in some cases. We had a router that would mostly, you know, it's going to select a view, but in other cases it's going to like load some data, or it's going to redirect to a different view or route, or do some authentication or authorize something, or it's going to render a view or whatever. Then views themselves, they're going to deal with the obvious view things, like what they're meant to, which is HTML rendering, displaying subviews, and handling UI interactions. But they might also be doing some of this. Like if we look at our code and we're honest with ourselves, like some of our views are loading data, right? I just said before we have those interstitial views that are really like controllers or something. So there was too much overlap between the view and the router. So what we wanted to do was basically just wedge something in the middle of those two and start pulling them apart as best we could. So we went with this idea of a route. So for now, it's sort of just take the intersection and put it all in something else. And build like a proper way for these three things to interact, which we didn't have obviously before. So hooray, we came up with a solution, super obvious. How do we build it? So we, just to take the example that I showed you way back in the beginning, we had this go to page method that would always do the same thing, and then after it did the same thing, that view, which is the same thing it did was render a view, it would have the option of doing any of the things that were in the shared part of the Venn diagram. So we want to introduce that middle piece. So what we ended up building was this idea of a route object and building a backbone router. So we just took backbone router, we re-implemented the like route method that would map routes into backbone history, and we allowed for more steps in the pipeline. So previously, you have some route maps to some function, and then eventually Backbone will apply that function with some arguments and some route data. So what we wanted to do was say, okay, well that's going to map to a route object, which we're going to be able to configure, and it's going to be able to have its own bits and bobs. And then that's going to call a prepare method, which is going to return a promise. And the prepare method is going to, when it's resolved, we're going to call execute on the route. And if it fails, we're just going to tell the route that there was an error. And then the route can do anything it wants. So it can handle the error, and it can say, like, I'm a modal route, and I'm going to just close the modal and then open a new modal that says, like, this went wrong, or whatever. Or it can just ignore it, and then we'll bubble the error back up through the router out to the application and let the application handle it. So one of the other key things that I want to point out is we looked around and we tried to see if there were other router options out there or other things that would sort of solve this problem, and we couldn't find one that really did what we wanted when we started building this. So one of the things that we had to keep in mind was being able to still support this old way of doing things, which is the route maps to some function on the router or some function on a controller in Marionette land, or just some callback function that's defined in line. Because we weren't going to go, if I actually showed you like what our routes look like, it's like, there's maybe like there's a lot of them. And we weren't going to just go and rip them all out and like throw these things in and then be like, yeah, ship it. So we took a little bit of time. So I don't know, can anybody even see that? Is that too small for people in the back? Well, I'm going to take that as a yes. Yeah, I know, I've been trying to work on that. Let's see. Ha! Oh man, I should have done that the whole time. Go me. Cool, so this is just a high level sort of how you would use this thing that we built. So we've been calling it Backbone.Blazer, and it has our own router, and so this is exactly what like a normal Backbone router might look like, right? So you have some like default route that's the home route. Normally that would just be a function, like the one down here, that maybe asks the app what its main region is, and it shows a view that it's going to construct and stuff's in there. Ignore all the window dot crap, that's just me hacking something up in my browser to make it sure it worked. So these are all the other ways that you could possibly set something up. So basically, it supports the common existing use case and then this other route object thing. There's this, nothing too interesting there. Let's go to the next one. So this is what a route might look like. So there's a prepare function. This is basically the code that was in our before render method. So that code's never going to go away, but it's also never going to get more interesting than that. And then when that returns a promise, if it succeeds, it's going to call this execute method, which is just going to do the rendering of the view for us. So that's pretty much it. That's what we built. It's on its way to open source, so I think I'm going to open source it tonight. And then we have a whole bunch of things that we want to add to it. Obvious ones being the ability to filter before a route happens. So one case that we have is being able to just say, like, this is the sign-up route, so it's not authenticated. and all the other routes are authenticated. So, so we want to maybe have like a filters array at the top that will basically call some functions and ask our app what state it's in. Is it in a logged in user state? And then go from there. And then just the ability to sort of like chain those filters together. So yeah. So yeah, questions. I'm going to have my buddy Dan come up here. He helped work on this with me. So if anybody has any questions or concerns or comments or whatever, then hit us.